It.
When you were on the bridge and you saw the Japanese ships for the first time, what did that make you feel like?
This is interesting. When we had battle stations, even before this battle, every morning you would get to your station before daylight. So when the daylight came, your eyes got accustomed to looking over the horizon. My position was all the way up on top near the 24-inch searchlight. I was the highest point of the ship. I had complete view of the ocean all the way around. Now, as I said to you, when we went to battle stations, you went while it was still dark, and as the dawn began to come, you could pick out any silhouette on the horizon, and it could tell you what kind of a ship it was, and from that you had to determine if it was a Japanese or an American. So I could see the ships on the horizon, and I thought to myself, what are our ships doing there? This particular day, I remember my eyes, I was up on top, I could see on the horizon the ships. When I saw them, the captain and the officers saw them the same way. I called out battleships, battle formation down to the bridge. Well, somebody had to hear it. But then when your eyes got accustomed, the ships got bigger because you could see more. But you always went to your battle stations before daylight. My first recollection was to see them all lined up. That's just the way the ships went. Then as activity started, they start turning towards the ship. And then when they turned, they got close enough broadside, they would start firing.
Describe how many ships you saw.
I saw 6, 3 full-size battleships. How do I know they were battleships? You understand now, they're on the horizon, it's getting daylight, and you could pick out by the guns. Remember I said to you that when they start firing, you could see the shell come out of the gun, and then the puff of smoke. That's how close they were. A Jeep aircraft carrier was originally built as a cargo ship by the Kaiser shipyards in Seattle, Washington. As the war began to change, they needed more firepower, so they converted these cargo ships to aircraft carriers just by putting a wooden deck. The decks were all wood, so if a plane hit, it would splinter the wood and not splinter the metal. The name Kaiser Coffin came because, as I said in the beginning, they were built in the Kaiser shipyard with a 1/4 inch, which was supposed to be just to transport material and planes. And then all of a sudden, here they are. And when they were built as a ship for cargo, they did not have the escape hatches they should have had. So we didn't have a number of escape hatches. If a shell had hit the engine room, they'd have no way of getting out. There was only like 1 or 2 hatches, so to speak, not doors, hatches. Part of our work was to provide air support for the men on the beaches before they landed and while they were landing. The landing was usually in the early morning where you could see where you were going. They would leave the ship and they would go against the island, drop their bombs and all their shells, come back, reload, go out again. Okay, that kept us a safe distance from the shore. We couldn't get too close because of 2 reasons. One, we didn't know what the ground underneath would be, how many rocks and such. We didn't know how much firepower the Japanese would still have to hit a ship that close. So we were offshore. When the Marines landed the one day, it was the biggest downpour of water you ever saw. 2 days and 2 nights. I felt sorry for the Marines, but there I am, having a hot meal on a ship, and these guys are laying in the mud. And I mean, it was mud. Nothing happened for 2 days. They just got on the beach. Then as they advanced, that's when the Japanese were waiting for them. The Second Battle of the Philippine Sea, which I was in, was the biggest, longest naval battle in naval history. All the previous war battles on the ships in history were not as long or as heavy as this particular battle.
What can you tell me about Admiral Sprague?
He was an admiral.
He was the commander of your fleet. Okay.
He made a mistake. They wouldn't admit it, but he had the fleet divided going south where the Japanese were coming from the north. He didn't leave enough ships up north to ward off the Japanese battleships and their cruisers and their air power. So he made some mistakes, but you did not admit a mistake if you were an admiral.
Absolutely not. What was his strategy in dealing with this Japanese fleet that came out of nowhere?
His strategy?
Yeah.
He blew it because the fleet came where he was not expecting it. That's what I tell you in the beginning, that we saw these ships on the horizon. They weren't supposed to be there, and there they were. So he was as surprised as our officers were to see.
Let me ask you this. How much time do you think went by between you first spotting those ships and them turning and starting to fire on you?
2 minutes.
That fast?
Yeah, well, they're coming, understand? And they were ready to fire because they were geared for battle. We were just geared to let the Marines off the day before, and the planes, and our planes were not on the ship. They were already over the island. So we were really unprotected until the planes came back in.
So you're going up against Japanese battleships that have armor that's that wide. Show me again. Japanese battle. That's that thick.
12 to 14 inches wide.
And how thick was your armor?
1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. They had 2 big battleships. One of them was the biggest battleship the Japanese had. I forget the name. It was their biggest ship. The others were big size too. The reason I'm told that the ships were there, they left Japan with the idea that they would cruise down and engage the American Navy along the way. Never did they thought that the 2 carriers that we were the big class, the Essex class, and that surprised them to find 2 big carriers in that area. The fleet, you have to understand, was spread out inside Leyte Gulf, on the other side of Leyte, among the islands, and out in the ocean. When you have a fleet like that, there's no concentration of power. It's not like a boat parade down the Chicago River. You're out there. As they got closer, we weren't making any tracks, so to speak, because we weren't under full speed yet. We had to go south. Then when I saw the puff of smoke and then the shell leave the gun, I knew how long it would take before the shell would come close to the ship. Maybe a minute, maybe a 1/2 minute, and that you timed the shell. You could see the smoke, the fire come out the gun. Then you saw the shell over, and then you looked in to see if it went alongside of you, behind you, or over you. The first shells they shot were armor piercing, which went right through the ship on one side, out the other side. 5 shells hit the ship that way and did no damage because they didn't hit below the water line. 1/4 inch, when the shell went through, all you heard was a whoosh, because it didn't hit anything. I mean, it didn't hit the bulkhead, it just went right on through. Then when they start using the other shells, you did hear a bang, and the most important thing was the ship shook. It shuddered. and sometimes we thought it would raise out of the water. Well, we were hit about 9 times, and one of the shells went down below deck and killed 8 men at one time. Then as the battle progressed, the ship next to us, behind us, U.S. Gambier Bay, was hit by a number of shells. 300 men on the ship were lost because they drowned and couldn't get out of the water. Gambier Bay was about the same size as the Clinton Bay. They were all built on the same hull. I saw the smoke when the first shell hit, and then another shell hit, and this time the 2 shells hit just right, and they went below the hangar deck and went into the engine room. All of a sudden there was black smoke, and then the ship began to list. List to one side, and then more so, and then finally it list down to where the ship was at water level. Well, I saw the sailors jumping off the ship, off the flight deck, and as many that could get out of the ship into the water. When you saw the men in the water, we couldn't stop. We were told just to get out of there. I could see the men floating in the water, their heads bobbing. And I said to one of the officers, aren't we going to stop and pick up these men? The destroyers will pick up what they can, but we can't. Again, you cannot stop. But once you stop the motors, you didn't like a car where you could turn the key on. And then, again, you got to understand, the Japanese had such listening devices, they could tell if a ship stopped, and when it stopped, they were there. And the sad part was, you see these sailors swimming, you could see them. That's how close they came. And you couldn't do anything. You couldn't throw them a life jacket or a rope. What good would it do? So we went. The idea was that the destroyers and the destroyer escorts, the smaller destroyer, would eventually get there to pick them up. Well, the ship got hit so fast and so hard that there wasn't much time for these sailors to get into the rifle rafts or so. Plus, we did not carry extra life jackets or life rafts on the carriers because you weren't supposed to get hit. Had the Japanese adjusted their shells, we would have been next in line. We were close enough to the Gambier Bay to see the men jumping off the ship. That's close. Okay, then along come the Japanese torpedo ships. They fired 4 torpedoes at the Clinton Bay. For some unknown reason, either their setting was off, 2 went in front of us, 2 behind us. 3 times we come where we could see the torpedo coming towards the ship. And it just so happened that it didn't gain enough speed and we were able to turn. Now, you don't turn these ships around like you would a bicycle or a car. You got to have the speed and you got to have the distance to turn, even to maneuver. So we did not get hit by a torpedo, thank God. Then when the Japanese stopped shooting, along came the kamikazes.
Have you ever heard of a kamikaze before this battle? You've never heard of them before? So the first time you ever saw kamikazes was at the second Battle of the Philippine Islands. Well, what was going through your head when you saw these planes flying directly into ships? What was that like?
Hope the hell they don't hit us. And if they hit us, hold on to something. Now, I'm up on top, understand. You have to look at a picture of the ship to see what I'm talking about. Mind you now, you're 19 years old. You're up there watching this thing like a movie until the kamikazes came and the shells, you didn't think anything about it. You could see what you could see. When the kamikazes start coming, then you begin to think, hey, one of these guys is going to hit us and we're going to go down. To be honest with you, John, you didn't think. This is all new. This is the first time you've seen it. Now, if I was to see it again, I would probably be scared because I know what could have happened. Kamikazes took a pledge to end their life by hitting a ship. The kamikazes were a lightweight Japanese airplane. They did not have much fuel because they carried just a couple of torpedoes on the torpedoes, and the others carried the ammunition. The kamikazes, in their flight pattern, usually had the sun behind them, and they were quite high. And then when they came down, it seemed to come out of nowhere, and the whole idea of the kamikaze was if they hit the deck at the right angle, it'd be catastrophic. It all happened so fast, and before you knew it, there was another kamikaze coming, and you could see by the angle if he was going to hit the ship or not. When the kamikazes were coming, they had a plan that they would fly just above the water. So the 45 millimeter guns that we had were set at a certain angle for if the planes were flying. They could only deject a certain angle. Well, these Japanese planes would come over the water so we couldn't hit them. So finally our gunnery officer figured out we would shoot in front of the plane and the water would splash up, hit the propeller, and stop the plane. Well, it did a few times, and a couple other times some of our gunners would hit one or two of the kamikazes. We were hit by 4 kamikaze planes. 2 of them bounced off because they came at the wrong angle. They hit the wooden deck and they bounced in the water. 2 of them hit us square on the deck, and about that time, the officers told us to come down from that high point. I went down to the next lower level, which was still up on top, and one of the kamikazes hit the ship and exploded. Well, part of the engine of this kamikaze that hit us exploded and went through 4 panes of glass and the bulkhead and landed on a deck. Had the windows not been there, the shrapnel from that plane could have wiped out 3 or 4 men. A piece of the kamikaze cylinder, about 2 inches by 4 inches, went through the glass, ended on the floor, on the deck. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, didn't realize what it was. Later on, as I looked at it, it had the Japanese marking on the cylinder. So then what the ground crew did, they pushed the plane off, actually pushed the Japanese plane off, distinguish any burning of the wood. Now to understand, the decks on a carrier are made of wood, not metal. They're made of wood for 2 reasons. If that plane hit metal, it would demolish itself more so, our plane. But the wood was a cushion. So sometimes the wood would start burning from the kamikazes that would hit it and bounce off. But when you see these planes coming, and when we knew these 2 were gonna hit, and we hid behind this glass panels, and the shell, the fragment from the motor went right through the glass and through the 1/4 inch. That was close. The 2 that hit didn't have any torpedoes. Had they had torpedoes on them, that would have been the end of it, the torpedo hitting the deck. And that was another reason for the wooden decks, to help it not detonate. If it was a metal deck, it would really blow it up. A total of 4 kamikazes hit our ship. and only one did damage, the one that I'm talking about, that exploded close to the bridge. All the rest bounced off or went too soon. Had the Japanese used the kamikaze initially, they would have wiped out the two carriers plus the destroyers without losing any of their ships. The kamikazes destroyed more ships than the Japanese did with their firepower. And the interesting thing was that for some reason the kamikazes stopped coming.
Describe to me how, if the Japanese had defeated your Navy, what that would have meant to the American troops on the beaches.
Well, they would have been annihilated because there'd be nothing behind them to ward off the Japanese that they were going up against. You got to understand, on those islands, the Japanese built fortifications over a couple of years. They just didn't throw dirt up. They built them because they had occupied those islands for as many as 3 or 4 years. So they had time to build the concrete bunkers and all.
Those troops would have all been destroyed.
Had the Japanese Navy at that time came forward and wiped out the carriers and the destroyers, by the time the American Navy would have come up from south, they would have had command of the waters. And once you get command of the waters, you form a line and you have your firepower. It would have been disastrous. It would have been the end of them because they couldn't go forward because they were run up against pillboxes, and they couldn't go back on the beach because there was no ships to take them back. They would have been massacred right in the water, right at the beach.
Were you afraid of getting killed? Were you ever afraid of dying?
You thought about it, and you said your prayers that night, and you didn't dwell on it because we used to say, that next shell, if it's got my name on it, that's mine. And that's it. You didn't make an issue of it. You didn't carry it on in conversation when you were eating chow about who got killed or such. You didn't dwell on it because it would have been demoralizing. The only firepower we had was a 5-inch gun on the tail, on the back of the ship. We fired that. What little it did, I don't know, but it was a firing power. The destroyers were used to set a smoke screen between us and the Japanese. So the destroyers went towards the Japanese ships. They got as close as they could, and they set up the smokestacks to make as much smoke as possible, burned all the oil I think they had, to create a screen. These little old destroyers took their life in their hand. In order to lay the smoke screen, they had to be much closer to the battleships than we were. The destroyers had more armament than we did because they were built to be battle ready. Yet they couldn't be too heavy because they had to be light enough to maneuver in the water such as they did here. And they had to be light enough to make a tight circle. We couldn't make a tight circle. They could. So the construction of the destroyers were still along the lines of the destroyers of World War I. The armament, the radar, the sonar, the firepower. They call them tin cans because that's what they were. They were made out of tin. They weren't made for the action that they went into. But the mentality of the Japanese was they had so much pride in their battleships. They built them so big. They weren't counting on maneuverability. And they built them, they weren't counting on speed. When we saw the first battleships, they were like sitting ducks in water because they weren't moving. They were aiming on us. And as I said, when they started firing their shells, they had to be broadside, so they couldn't go anywhere. Understand, before all of this battle started, the destroyers were parallel to the carriers to protect them from the torpedoes that might have been sent by a submarine. The submarines shot a lot of torpedoes, okay? And then when the destroyers start going toward the battleships, it was just a matter of minutes before they set up a smoke screen and you couldn't see anything. We couldn't see them, we couldn't see us. They couldn't see us. The destroyers used it as a distracting action to go towards the battleships.
Describe how much danger and how much valor was involved in that.
Well, they were really the heroes of the water at that time, because when the Japanese saw these destroyers coming towards them, my observation is that they were surprised to see ships coming towards them when we are going away from them.
Why do you think the Japanese gave up?
Because when they realized that these were carriers, they thought it was the big carrier. And then that was the reason. I mean, there was no other reason that we could figure. And then the destroyers came towards them, and then when we put up the smoke screen, they couldn't see us. Well, by this time, we're moving out of the area, and then by this time, American planes were coming toward the ships. We didn't sink any ships with the American planes. Why they didn't come? They kept coming forward, but we kept moving away. And then it came nighttime. Nighttime was our protection. What the smoke didn't hide, the nighttime did. So at nighttime, then you're going, no lights, no smoking, no nothing on the ship. Complete dark. Hoping to hell that we could get away in the dark. Well, by the next morning, we're at our battle station. We go through the same routine, looking over the horizon. There were no ships. They stopped.
The Japanese were gone.
The Japanese didn't follow through because they heard that the Middle Fleet was coming. And the Middle Fleet had the battleships, the cruisers, and a couple of aircraft carriers, and some submarines. That was a whole different fleet. The night of the battle was the most, what I'm trying to say, dangerous, because the Japanese knew where we were at, and we didn't know where they were at. And they had submarines in the water. Had they come up with a submarine and fired at least one torpedo, they would have sunk us, because already we weren't under full power as far as the power to move the ship. The scariest part of this whole thing was that afternoon. This started in the morning, you understand. That afternoon and that evening, when we're going with these holes in the side, hoping that the water doesn't get rough and that we don't get too much water in the ship. So if we were still around the next morning, that was a thank God, because we could have sunk at night. We got through the night, and as I said, that was the time when we had cold cuts, all the food you wanted. They opened up the food lockers and we had food. The next day, again, was cold cuts. By this time, I was up on my battle station again before dawn, before sunrise. Didn't see a ship on the horizon. Didn't see anything on the horizon. This way, forward, aft, no ships. As I'm told later on, what happened when the Japanese encountered us, instead of following up, they turned around and went back toward Japan. They thought that we were the beginning of a fleet. Which one admirals, I don't know. So they thought that since we were the first ships of the fleet, behind us would come our battleships and our full-size carriers. That was their big mistake. Well, in a battle, there are no mistakes. We counted 9 holes in the side of our carrier, and the holes went right through the bulkhead, across the hangar deck. The hangar deck is where we had the planes stored. Well, we had so many holds and there was so much weight on the ship that what we had to do is throw overboard some of the airplanes that were being repaired, airplane parts. I was in the electrician division, the E division, and we were told to dispose of anything that had weight. Fans, water coolers, we just threw them over the sides, old tools and all, so that we could lighten the ship. Now the holes below the water line, now you understand, were at least 4 to 6 inches big in diameter. So the way you blocked it, you got these corks and a mattress, and you put the mattress and you hit it with the corks and sledgehammers going against the water coming in, and then you got 2x4s and 4x4s as braces to keep the corks in. You were hoping that the mattress would hold the cork and the cork would hold the mattress. Understand, after a while, these mattresses got water soaked. So what you did is you put more pieces of wood behind them, more 2x4 and 4x4. You went that way until you got out of the battle zone, and then you could replace the mattresses and the corks. We lost a total of 8 men. Some were killed in the engine room, some were killed on the hangar deck, but 8 men were killed. I was lucky in that where I was at, other than that shrapnel that hit, nothing else hit. When we got out to the Pacific, you begin to wonder, will I come back or not? Will I die here or will I go back in one piece? Well, after a while, you didn't much care because you're 19 years old, you're taking it as it goes, you're part of the strongest Navy in the world. This now is 1944, where we begin to turn the tide. Then I didn't think any more about it. I developed the attitude that comme ci, comme ça, what'll be, what'll be. I think that's what it is. And
Okay, Sarah, Sarah.
Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. Sarah, Sarah. In Polish means something else. We won't go into that.
Okay.
So, after the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea, we were always on the alert because when we saw what could be done and how powerful the Japanese were, and that they had the kamikazes, you got concerned. How concerned? When the time comes, the time comes. And these fellows that got killed in the Radio Shack was down below. Here I am up on top. These guys are down below, and they get killed. Out of the 8 or 9 men that we lost, we didn't know how many, but they didn't advertise. I think I knew 3 of them somewhat on a speaking basis. You didn't form any real close buddies because you're out there in the water. You don't know who's going to get killed, what, where, when. I had a group of about 4 or 5 fellows who were all from the Chicago area. Bill Muldoon was one who survived 13 days in the water on a destroyer he was at that got sunk. And when Bill came on the ship, every meal he ate as if it was his last meal. When we had breakfast, he'd say, "You going to finish those eggs?" He would eat them. Toast, he would eat them. His reasoning was that if this ship goes down, I'm not going to starve. I'm going to be full of food. You didn't think about it, John. You wrote letters home. If you could have read my letters home, you'd think this guy's on vacation. I mean, he's not in the battle. He's not on a ship. Some of these guys used to get letters from their family, and they'd write them, "Oh, my back hurts. Oh, we did this, we did that." And this one guy used to write so goddamn much about what happened. And it's not the censors censored every letter, so you couldn't tell him I was in this battle, that battle. About his medical problems. I never wrote anything home. Everything's okay. Food's good, I'm okay. I got my hands and fingers. I'm happy, I'm well. the largest naval battle of all times. And the way the outcome was the interesting thing. Destroyed 2 fleets at one time. And as I said to you before, you could see the ships on the horizon. And that was the thing. At first I thought they were our battleships and our carriers, but I thought, what are they doing north of us when we're on the south end of the world? Then I realized when the shells started coming that they weren't the good guys. The Secretary of the Navy, Washington, D.C., June 19, 1946. My dear Mr. Pajor, I have addressed this letter to reach you after all the formalities of your separation from active service are completed. I have done this so because within the formality, but as clearly as I know how to say, I want to have the Navy's pride in you, which it is my privilege to express, to reach into your civil life and to remind you of the Navy always. You have served in the greatest Navy in the world. It crushed 2 enemy fleets at once, receiving their surrender only 4 months apart. It brought our land-based air power within bombing range of the enemy and set your ground armies on the beachheads of final victory. It performed the multiple of tasks necessary to support these military operations. No other Navy at any time has done so much. For your part in these achievements, you deserve to be proud as long as you live. The nation which you served at a time of crisis will remember you with gratitude. The best wishes of the Navy go with you into the civilian life. Good luck. Sincerely, James Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy. Dum, da, dum, 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 dum.